Hey everybody, so let's start using Houdini to begin exploring some of the concepts in the Zettl. And we can start on page 21 with the nature of shadows. Illustration 2.3 shows us how shadows define space, and we can actually model this scene exactly in Houdini. So we have on the left 2 lights and a camera illuminating a sphere and a disk, and on the right we have a single spotlight and a camera illuminating the sphere and the disk as well. So we can build this scene. So first of all, let's add our sphere. And you see how the sphere is kind of blocky? It's kind of rough around the edges. That's easy to fix. We can make a smooth sphere just by diving into the sphere and increasing its rows and columns. And then we get a nice smooth-edged sphere. We're making it higher resolution. Back out, and now we'll add our disk, which is just a tube. And let's, that tube is in the same space as the sphere, so let's take the sphere and translate it a meter to the left, and take the tube and translate it a meter to the right. I'm translating here 1 meter, negative 1 meter on the x-axis, which means 1 meter to the left. And the tube I've moved 1 meter to the right. Now, of course, this tube doesn't look a lot like our disk yet for a couple of reasons. We'll dive into the tube. We'll do the same thing. We'll increase its columns to make it nice and smooth. We'll rotate it 90 degrees. We'll make it less high, maybe 0.25. And now we're getting there, but it's still hollow. So if we go up here, we can add end caps. And now we've got, just like in the Zettl, we've got a sphere and a disk. So let's add a background and a floor to this. And we can do that just using boxes. Drag a box in. Oh, I have to escape the tube first. We want to drag our box in at the object level so that it doesn't become part of the tube. So drag in a box, and we can make this box really wide and tall and thin, like just a 1/4 meter. And now if we look at this from the top, there's our background wall, so we obviously have to move it back in space. So we'll translate it backwards by 2 meters. And now it's a wall behind our 2 objects. And to make a floor, we can just duplicate this box. So we can copy it and paste it, making a box 2, and rotate the second box and translate it down, translate it on the y-axis down. And now we've got our 2 objects with a background and a floor. If this grid is sort of visually getting in the way for you, you can turn off that grid right there. And now we need a camera with which to view this scene. So we create a camera, put it down, and here it creates a camera between our 2 objects. So obviously this camera is not going to see either of these objects. This camera is looking at the wall. And if we go to the camera's view here, we'll see that's exactly what's happening. So let's move this camera back in space. Let's translate it 4 meters back. And now we can see our shapes. So our camera has been moved 4 meters on the z-axis. And if we look, now we can see the camera is here, looking at the scene. Now, if we want to be able to be looking through the camera and move the camera as we look through it, that's what this lock is for. That locks the camera position to the view. So now as I change my view, I'm also interactively changing the camera's position. And that's a very useful mode to be in. So let's add some lights to this. What Zettl calls a soft light, we're going to use a point light. A point light's like a light bulb. It is a soft light. It radiates light in all directions. So let's pull down a point light, and notice it puts it right in the middle of our scene, illuminating the sphere and the edge of the disc. And this is pretty interesting just in itself. And if we want to see what this looks like fully rendered, switch over to the render view, hit the render button, and this will render a detailed version of the scene with shadows. See, the sphere is casting a shadow over here, the disc is casting a little shadow in the corner. And this gives us a much more realistic rendering of the lighting. So let's go back to our scene view and put this light in the position that it is in the illustration. So here it might be useful to use a top view. This doesn't affect the camera. See, the camera is still there. We can just take that light and move it over to the position where Zettl has one of the lights. And we can see already it's a little bit dim, so let's turn up the intensity. I'll give it intensity of 3 times as bright as the default. Switch back to the camera view, and now we can get a rough description of the lighting, or if we want a detailed description of the lighting with shadows, go to the render view, and we can see there's the shadow of the sphere on the wall, there's the shadow of the disc on the wall. If we add the second light, go back to the scene view, we can take this. Another way to duplicate things in the computer is Option, click, and drag. Copy and paste is fine too. And then we can take the second light, translate it to the right, and take a look at that in the render view. So here we're seeing multiple shadows, and we're seeing the roundness of the sphere and the flatness of the disc. So let's take a look at the other example that he has there. We could turn off these lights by clicking on them and unchecking enable. That will turn the lights off. Switch back to my scene view, and I'll add a spotlight. And a spotlight, as you can see already, creates a much different type of lighting effect. So if we go back to the top viewport, we can see right now this spotlight is close to the wall. We'll move it back and move it over to the right. And then because it's a spotlight, it also has a direction. So we'll change the direction by rotating it. And we'll also increase the intensity of this spotlight. Let's take it up to intensity of 5. Go back to our camera view, and we can see a similar effect to what we're seeing in the textbook. And when we switch to the render view, we'll see that with shadows, how the dimensionality of the sphere is brought out, but the flatness of the disc remains. And we might have to turn up these intensities even more. And so using these tools, we can now render the scenes that are being described in the book and make modifications to them and really study how the lights and the shapes interact in space, and study how the shadows work and look at the scene from different camera angles as well. We're still locked to our camera, so if we want to see this scene from the top, can hit escape, reposition our camera, and we can look at this same lighting situation from a high angle, go back to the render view, and we're looking down on this scene from above, so we can see how each light interacts with the shapes and casts shadows. And of course, what we've already learned about color also applies here. So we can go into the sphere, drop down a color node, connect it, render it, and choose a color. Now the sphere is red. We can do the same thing with the disk. We can hit the U key to go back up to our object level. Go into the tube. Add a color node. Connect the node. Set the render. Choose the color for our disk. Go back to the scene view, and we see the objects without shadows and with rudimentary lighting. Go into the render view, and we see them rendered with much more detail and with their shadows. So working with abstract shapes is good and interesting, but of course one runs out of interesting things to do with basic shapes relatively quickly. So we can also import models into our scene. So I'm going to turn off the rendering on both the sphere and the tube. Go back to my scene view. And I'm going to import a 3D model. And I'll provide this 3D model to you. I'm going to say File, Import, and in this case we're going to be importing a GLTF scene. And you don't have to change anything in this. You can just say import, and it will import an object into our scene that then we can light in a much more interesting way. I can rotate the object and see this much more detailed object rendered. And so now you can begin to work with the concepts in the Zettl that deal with facial lighting. For instance, we could do a fast fall-off situation. I'm going to disable my spotlight, go back to the scene view, turn on one of my point lights, go back to my top viewport, and move that light right next to the model. Go back to my camera view, hit escape to get the controls back, and render this with a fast fall off. So I'm going to give you several lighting exercises to do, and you will, just like you did with the last assignment, you will save the HIP and C files and submit those on Dropbox.